Hi, Justin asked me to spend some time this afternoon talking with you guys about considerations for weed control in wheat. So we're going to paint with a big brush this afternoon and cover quite a bit of ground. We're going to start off talking a little bit about some of the herbicide resistant wheat varieties. We're starting to see some more varieties developed in some of those herbicide resistant traits. And so it'll be a good chance to look at those. Then we'll talk a little bit, just kind of some of the herbicide options that are out there and some things to consider in terms of, when to apply and things of that nature. And then we'll wrap up a little bit, just kind of, closing the loop and talking about managing weeds in wheat stubble. Specifically, we're going to look a little bit at field bindweed and volunteer wheat. So that's kind of the plan for the next probably 20 minutes or so. All right. So the first thing we need to talk about are the two types of herbicide resistant wheat. The first would be the Clearfield system. The Clearfield system is tolerant of applications of imazamox. The only formulation of imazamox that's labeled for use in Clearfield wheat is Beyond. So what you see there is a list of some of the varieties that have been evaluated in some of the K-State studies that are Clearfield varieties. The list there, a couple to point out would be the Double Stop and the Oakley. Those seem to be pretty popular in the western and central parts of the state. That is the older technology, okay? The newer technology would be coaxium wheat. And the herbicide that we can use there is quizalofop, or the branded product is called Aggressor. And we're starting to see several varieties become available with the trait of being resistant to quizalofop. And again, just listed some there. And I know Romulo had some good yield data on some of those varieties in his presentation. So to dig in a little bit more, just a reminder about the Clearfield system. Beyond is the herbicide that's labeled. The application rates are generally 4 to 6 ounces per application with a total of 8 ounces per season. You can use a nitrogen carrier with this. We tend to see better performance out of the Clearfield system with fall applications. So as you think about timing, I know sometimes it's advantageous to wait until spring to invest in herbicide applications, but if you're investing in the Clearfield system, you've already made that investment there. So we kind of like fall applications there. And then the other thing to remember is that there is a 9-month rotation to corn and sorghum. So that would be another reason to look at a fall application rather than a spring application there. Two types of Clearfield wheats out there. We do still have some folks using Oakley, which is the 1 gene Clearfield wheat. So it has a shorter window of application. Now, most of the folks using that are going to be west of where y'all are there in Barber County, but I just wanted to mention that. And then the other would be the 2 gene system. And so this has a broader window of application. So all the way from 2 leaf through the second joint. And the other advantage here is that you can use MSO as your surfactant with 2 gene Clearfield wheat. And so that gives us some enhancement in the weed control, especially when we think about things like downy brome and feral rye that can be real problems. And then switching gears and thinking about coaxium wheat, the rate here of Aggressor is 8 to 12 ounces with a 16 ounce per acre per year maximum application rate. You're looking to apply Aggressor when wheat reaches the 4-leaf stage all the way through jointing. Okay, and with all herbicides, we want to target smaller weeds. You do need a surfactant with Aggressor. I kind of like the crop oil. It tends to give a little better control. One thing to realize here is that Aggressor is only going to control grasses. Okay, it's only going to control grasses and it has no residual activity. So those are 2 big differences between those 2 herbicide resistant systems. When we look at Beyond, it does have some activity on mustards, assuming they're not herbicide resistant or ALS resistant. And it also does have some residual activity. So coaxium does not bring those two traits or those two qualities to the table, but it is going to be quite good on grassy weeds. The one exception there is that we tend to think a little bit maybe jointed goatgrass. I'm not sure, Justin, if that's a big problem in Barber County, but we tend to think that maybe the amazamox and beyond is a little better on jointed goatgrass than the quizalofop that's an aggressor. So just some things to think about as you're comparing those two systems if you're interested in herbicide resistant weeds. The other thing that we need to talk about, and actually we've been kind of talking about this a lot in the soybean systems and other parts of the state, as folks have been using more 2,4-D. There is actually a pretty consistent and meaningful level of antagonism that occurs when 2,4-D is applied with these group 1 herbicides, ACCase inhibiting herbicides like quizalofop or aggressor. So just be aware of that as you're planning, especially your spring herbicide applications. If you're thinking about using aggressor with 2,4-D, you're going to want to make sure you use that maximum rate of the aggressor. That's the one thing we found consistently that can help overcome that antagonism, is just to increase the rate of the group 1 herbicide. There's been mixed results in terms of adjusting adjuvant systems and things of that nature, but the one, if you need to apply them together, the one thing to do is to apply that higher rate of the aggressor. The other thing I think is really important to touch on as we think about these herbicide resistant wheats, they're big news for wheat producers and giving you some more options in terms of weed management in your wheat production systems. But we got to think about product stewardship and maintaining the use of these systems for the long term. Okay, so when we talk about product stewardship, a lot of times we talk about the importance of rotating crops, right? Rotating crops means rotating herbicides very often. Some things specific to these two products would be that with the Beyond label, there's actually no language that limits you in terms of how often you need to rotate away. But on the aggressor label, it specifically says you have to have at least 1 year between coaxium wheat crops. So just a couple of differences in the labels there as you read through the fine print. I know that's everybody's favorite thing to do, is to read herbicide labels. So there's those two facts. Now, here's where things start to get tricky. As we think about rotating crops, we've really reached a point where we're not necessarily rotating herbicides or herbicide modes of action. So Beyond is the same thing as Imiflex and grain sorghum. So if you are in a wheat sorghum rotation or growing sorghum as part of your rotation and are interested in iGrowth sorghum, the Imiflex product is the same thing there. And then an older product, Raptor, that can be used in a lot of legume crops, is the same active ingredient. So just because you're rotating crops there doesn't necessarily mean you're rotating herbicides. And the same thing for aggressor. Aggressor is the same thing as First Act. So if you're interested in double team sorghum, you'll be using the same product there if you use double team sorghum and coaxium wheat. And then again, if you're interested in growing broadleaf crops, Assure 2 is the exact same active ingredient and has been used in broadleaf crops for many years. So again, no actual changes in the herbicides that we're using to control grasses in these systems just because we've changed crop species. We haven't changed herbicide systems. So as we think about managing and maintaining the usefulness of these systems, we need to think about making sure that we're getting maximum weed control out of these systems and that we are actually rotating away from these herbicides as much as possible so we don't expand our herbicide resistant weed problem, because it would be very unfortunate to lose the coaxium and the double team technology here in terms of their ability to be very effective on grassy weeds. So these next couple of slides I know are going to be a little bit busy, but it's just kind of sharing some things, highlighting some information, really coming out of the chemical weed control guide in terms of herbicide options at different times. So what you see here is just a list of some of the herbicides that are available at planting. Some things to draw your attention to in terms of the breadth of weeds that they control would be amber and finesse. They do a good job on a lot of our problem grasses and broadleaves, assuming that we don't have ALS resistance. So they can be applied either pre or post. Other products on this list to think about, Pixaro here is a relatively new product. It's a combination of fluroxypyr, which is starane, and haloxyphin, which is a relatively new herbicide with the same mode of action as fluroxypyr, 2,4-D, and dicamba. So it's a group 4 product. So it's still a little pricey as an option, but it might be something that folks would want to consider in some situations. Another product to point out on this list would be Sharpen. We consider Sharpen to be more of a broadleaf burn down herbicide. It does have a little bit of residual activity, but not a great deal. And so we want to make sure that we're not counting on that for a lot of residual activity, and also want to make sure that we're not allowing it to come in contact with wheat seed. So let's assume you plant and then spray before the wheat comes up. That would probably result in an injury to your crop. But I pointed out amber and finesse. We'll come back to those here in a couple of slides and look at some things related to those. So as we think about some of the post-emergence herbicide options, we do have a few more options here. Some of the more common ones would be to apply 2,4-D, dicamba, 2,4-D plus ally, amber, and Pixaro, two that we pointed out in the previous slide, are also options for post-emergence herbicides. Quellex or Culex is also this group 4 herbicide, haloxyphin, plus a group 2 herbicide that can be useful for controlling some broadleaf weeds post-emergence as well. One of the things to pay attention to, I did on this slide just note, most of these products can be applied with nitrogen as a carrier. Things to think about there would be making sure that you don't use too much nitrogen as a carrier. Many of them allow for up to half of your carrier volume to be nitrogen. Some of them it is a little bit less. And also when you're using nitrogen as a carrier, you're going to increase your risk for crop injury. And so a lot of times we bring down those recommendations for adjuvants and surfactants in that particular tank mix situation. So be sure to double check the labels as you think about using nitrogen as a carrier in particular. The other thing to think about here is application timing. I've only been here in Kansas for not quite 2 years, but I've already seen some oopses in terms of both of the topics we've talked about so far. I've seen oopses where folks sprayed clearfield wheat with aggressor. That doesn't end well. And I've seen some scenarios where folks have applied some of the group 4 herbicides like MCPA too late and really caused some injury and yield loss to their wheat crop. So thinking about application timing is very important. So I kind of listed the products on the slide in order of what can be applied first, earliest, through latest. And so, one thing to really pay attention to, because we do use it so much, and I think most folks are aware of this, but 2,4-D really has the potential to limit tillering if you apply it too early. So just paying attention to that growth stage as you're thinking through your post-emergent herbicide applications, especially next spring, as you're taking care of this crop and seeing it through. All right, so rotation considerations. Many of the herbicides that we use in wheat are group 2 herbicides. They're ALS inhibiting herbicides. And one of the things about ALS inhibiting herbicides is that they have in some situations, a very long half-life in the soil. So they can stick around for a long time and cause injury to crops that are planted later, especially as we think about soils that have a low pH or low organic matter, and also low rainfall environment. Okay. The three main factors that contribute to the dissipation or the disappearance of these herbicides in the soil. Number one is rainfall. So no rain means no herbicide breakdown. Temperature is important. And then soil characteristics. So texture, organic matter, and pH. So what I did when I put this slide together is just, again, nobody likes reading herbicide labels, so I did some of that for you. Went through some of the crop rotation restrictions for some of the herbicides that we looked at on previous slides. Okay, so, Ally is a relatively popular herbicide. It has some fairly long rotation restrictions in some situations, particularly to soybean. You'll see soybean has a lot of concerns here. So if you are a person who considers double cropping after your wheat, Justin, I should have talked to you about how prevalent that is in your area before I put these slides together. But if that is something that you guys are doing, some of these herbicides could really limit your choices. But even grain sorghum has some limitations in terms of things like rave or glean or amber. So just think, as you're planning your weed management plan, I encourage you to think ahead to what's going to go in that field next year. Weather and markets notwithstanding, what is your kind of ideal situation there? And think about, how will this herbicide impact my ability to have some flexibility to respond to markets and weather and things of that nature next spring. All right, Justin asked me to talk a little bit about field bindweed. We had a nice conversation about the fact that this is a weed that has been around a long time. Anecdotally, the weed science group in the North Central region pretty much started and came together way back in like the 1940s because of field bindweed and the problems that we have had and continue to have controlling field bindweed. So there's really, two main times to think about controlling field bindweed with herbicides, and really herbicides are going to be the better option for controlling field bindweed. Tillage is tricky. You might be able to use it to stimulate some new growth, but you're also probably going to spread the problem. So really any potential benefits of tillage are outweighed by this very likely scenario of spreading field bindweed. So we generally don't recommend tillage for field bindweed control. In the fall, there are a couple of products that we have a good body of data to recommend. One would be dicamba. So as you're looking at a situation, if you think you want to use dicamba ahead of a wheat crop, let's say you're in a continuous wheat type of situation, you need to be sure that you're at least 45 days ahead of planting, or if your crop has already come up, the application window to apply dicamba begins at the 2-leaf growth stage. So those are some options for using dicamba to try to get ahead of field bindweed. Facet or quinclorac is another option there. It's going to need to be applied before planting, but the flip side of that is that we generally think that we get the best control right before a frost. So, when we think about Romulo's data looking at the effects of planting date, if you're planning on going to wheat, facet may not be a real great choice for your particular situation. The other option would be to try to control it in the spring. Glyphosate is one of the more effective options for spring applications. If you have a 4 pound per gallon formulation of glyphosate, the maximum rate there in a wheat crop is 32 fluid ounces per acre. And that needs to be done at least 7 days before harvest. So you'll have to kind of plan ahead a little bit and get on that sooner than later, probably. The other herbicide that tends to work a little bit better in the spring is 2,4-D. Um, and it needs to go on at 2 pints per acre is the kind of the low end for field bindweed control recommendations, but it's the high end for what we can use in crops or in the wheat crop. The other thing to talk about when we talk about field bindweed, it's a perennial weed. It has a root system that is very impressive. And so, not only do you have to kill what we see, we have to kill what we don't see that's below ground. And so anytime you're thinking about controlling field bindweed or other types of perennial weeds, Johnson grass is one that I get a lot of calls on. It generally is going to take multiple applications and multiple years to get the problem under control, because you've got to basically wear down the savings account, sort of, in terms of the energy that plant is using. So you have to kill the top and make it use some of that energy, and then kill the top again and just try to deplete those energy reserves that are in the root system. So we mentioned a little bit in the previous slide about, applying glyphosate as a pre-harvest application. So now let's we're thinking about the end of the production cycle here. So let's think about a little bit about post-harvest applications and what's happening in those wheat fields during the fallow period, beyond the field bindweed that we just talked about. A lot of things are going on. One of the things that's easy to see as you drive the highways and byways of Kansas and look at stubble fields, is Palmer amaranth and kochia, depending on where you are. It can really come in and be problems in those fields and contribute to the weed seed bank and create problems for us later on. But another problem that we really need to be aware of is the volunteer wheat concern. So I'm not a pathologist, but I do need to think about controlling volunteer crops because they are weeds. But one of the reasons we worry about volunteer wheat is because it serves as a green bridge to transmit diseases from one wheat field to the other, or from one crop to the other. So keeping that volunteer wheat out of your field and providing a good window of time where there is no host plant for insects and pathogens is very important for disease management in the wheat crop. So controlling volunteer wheat is very important. So some products that we can look at in terms of volunteer wheat control. Glyphosate is going to do about as good a job as anything on volunteer wheat. Atrazine can be effective on volunteer wheat, but you need to take into account some of your rotation considerations there as you think about atrazine. I know a lot of folks really like paraquat for their post-harvest or their fallow applications. One of the things to be aware of with paraquat, this is a picture of a field that had been burned down. There were some fairly large Palmer amaranth in that field, and you can see from the top it looks dead, but when you get down in there to some of those lower growing points, that plant is coming back. So paraquat is very satisfying and quickly produces plants that appear to be dead. But when you're dealing with things like Palmer amaranth, you need to put something that has a little bit of systemic activity in there to help with that. And so in this case, 2,4-D or dicamba would probably be the best options for you to consider there. Also like to talk a little bit, we mentioned atrazine. I've got flumioxazin or Valor on this list as well. It is a relatively inexpensive product that can give you some good control of broadleaf weeds and some grass activity, and give you some residual control. So as we think about truly that stubble field in the summer type of situation, something like a Valor can help us a lot. So those were the information slides I had prepared. I mentioned the chemical weed control guide. We're starting to think about the 2022 guide and getting that information together. So it's a good resource that has been around for a long time, and it's a privilege to get to keep that updated. And then the other resource that I like to share with folks is the War Against Weeds podcast. So it's something that I'm doing in collaboration with a couple of other weed scientists. And we're talking about the whole gamut of things related to weed management, but really, our emphasis is thinking about the fact that we have an increase in herbicide resistant weeds, which means we really need to have an increase in integrated management practices. And so, we're going back and thinking about, how do herbicides work? Why do herbicides work? Why does resistance happen? And then what are some of those non-chemical practices, and how do they work? And why don't we have more herbicides coming? Things of that nature. So anyway, it's been a fun project for me. And I hope that if you have access to a smartphone and listen to or a laptop and listen to podcasts, that would be something useful for you. So with that, Justin, was there any questions or anything you wanted to circle back to?
Can we touch a little bit on the volunteer wheat slide that you had? Is there specific diseases that volunteer wheat will serve as a vector for that we should be aware of or be concerned with?
Yeah, Justin, that's a good point. The disease that we talk about the most would be wheat streak mosaic virus. And so it's vectored by a little critter called a wheat curl mite, which is a very little critter that lives on wheat and a few other plants. And so it's important to take away kind of the habitat for that guy. So he dies and doesn't carry out his life cycle, and then move into a wheat crop and cause damage. And I think, one of the other things that's tricky about that is a lot of times that damage doesn't show up right away, right? And so we have to kind of put pieces together and figure out where the disease is coming from and things of that nature. But, it's just part of being a good neighbor, keeping your fields clean.
Yeah, being a good neighbor goes a long ways.
Mm-hmm.
Something I noticed a little bit more this year than in years past is, and I'm talking specifically Barber County. I wasn't out in a lot of other counties, but seen a lot of musk thistle this year. Is there some recommendations on how to head that off prior to it becoming a big issue?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you mentioned musk thistle in an annual cropping system. Usually we think about the thistles as problems in our pasture settings, right? So when we think about controlling thistles, the time is when they're a rosette, right? So difficult to see a rosette over or within a standing wheat crop. So it's easy to see how if once they're there, how that would have slipped by someone. But rosette stage 2,4-D is one of the more effective products that's in most of the Recs, or a mix of 2,4-D and dicamba. Metsulfuron, which is the active ingredient and ally, can also have some activity on musk thistles. So, really, if you're in a wheat crop, the thing just like everything else is getting on it at the right time. Sometimes I think we expect our herbicides to bail us out of things when we just get behind, and it just happens, right? Like, I'm not pointing fingers at anybody, it happens. But timeliness and 2,4-D is one of the things you can use to take care of those thistles.
Something I made a little note of, seems to be a habitual offender, is mare's tail in this part of the country. Any conversation on how to control that?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, you asked about this, Justin, and it is not listed in the weed control guide under the wheat section, which I found really interesting. So when we think about mare's tail, it's another case of, this is an annual plant, but it has a rosette that typically comes out in the fall or the early spring. And if you can control that mare's tail when it's still a rosette, I've seen 2,4-D formulations do quite well on it. If it's not resistant, there are some ALS inhibiting products that do quite well on mare's tail. Roundup used to be one of our go-tos for it, but again, resistance is an issue there. But timeliness is really the key thing there for that mare's tail. And so thinking about, those timing of those herbicide applications in the spring is really important. So balancing the economics of, when you can apply the cost-effective herbicides versus when you really need to be out there to get good weed control because of the weed size is something that folks should think about.
And I know you visited a little bit about it early in the presentation. I just want to kind of bring it back up again here towards the end. And could you elaborate a little bit or expand on which weeds are better controlled by Beyond versus which weeds are better controlled by Aggressor?
Yeah, so Aggressor is only going to control grasses. Okay, period. We can expect some broadleaf activity and some residual activity out of Beyond. When we think about comparing that grass control, one of the key ones that we look at that might tip the scales to choosing Beyond and choosing that Clearfield system would be jointed goatgrass. Jointed goatgrass tends to have a little bit better control with Beyond rather than with Aggressor. And then, we can also think a little bit about cheat sometimes tends to have a little bit better control with Beyond as well. So some slight differences, but you're not talking, going from 90% control to 50% control. You're talking going from, 90+% control to 80 to 90% control. So economically, there's a lot of factors to consider there in terms of what is the density of your weed problem, what is the resistance profile of your weeds, things of that nature.
I think I've only got one other question just kind of popped in my mind.
Sure.
And it's another habitual offender, and you touched on it briefly in your presentation. That's feral rye.
Oh,
is there something other than the annual walk the field, pull it by hand, put it in the sack, haul it off? Is there a solution that we can be looking at other than that?
So the Clearfield system can give you control of feral rye, but honestly, Aggressor is going to give you pretty good control of that feral rye, especially if you're out there timely with your applications. So yeah, good question, Justin. Habitual offender. You're right.
Oh yeah. Gives the high school kids something to do.
That's right.
Yep. I think that's all the questions I have. I don't know if Romulo's still on here, if he had anything he wanted to pick your brain on or not. But if not, I'd like to remind everybody about your podcast, War Against Weeds. And I sure thank you for taking time out of your day to visit with us about this.
Thanks for the invitation, Justin. Looking forward to seeing you in person soon.
You bet. Take care.
Bye-bye.